This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Reach out to the Kulkarni Law Firm for advice on PRC review, MRC review, developing SOPs, training, audit compliance, and more. Reach out to Darshan at kulkarnilawfirm.com or call me at 302-252-6959. Or you can just visit our website at DarshanTalks.com or visit the law firm website at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm really excited. I get to have the one, the only Rebecca Tushnet on again. And I'm so excited. Rebecca, good to see you again. How are you?
Good to see you. I'm doing well. I hope you're well.
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. And I get to have you at a time when our screens aren't frozen. And I get to have you at a time where we get to discuss some really fun things. But before we do, could you introduce yourself so that everyone knows how awesome you are?
Well, my name is Rebecca Tushnet. I teach law at Harvard, and I focus on intellectual property law and advertising law, especially in its relation to the First Amendment.
Perfect. And we've had you on. We've discussed this in multiple different ways, but I'm really excited because there have been some real cool things that are happening in the law right now. Let's start from a basic overall concept that you and I briefly discussed. This idea, before we got on, this idea of how would the FDA interpret things, and not necessarily the FDA itself, but how would the courts interpret the FDA's interpretation, technically, of something like something like the following. And let me give you a scenario. For the most part, in the advertising and promotional space, the FDA takes the position that you can't make a specific product claim without having two double-blinded placebo-controlled trials to support that claim. My question for you is, in your opinion, well, I'll tell you from my perspective, the FDA would generally say that those are the types of claims you want to have. But if you're going to go in and regulate a overall concept, an overall category of products, the FDA has been relatively silent on how they would see that. So let's say you were talking about certain types of drugs or the like. The FDA would generally say, has never opined on what they see in that context. What is your opinion from a First Amendment standpoint about the FDA's ability to regulate that, or is that something that the FTC should really be getting into?
So I guess at this point, I got to back up and say everything that we say, I think, needs a giant asterisk at this point, because it is quite possible that the Supreme Court is just going to completely upend everything that we think in ways that will be extraordinarily surprising. And, there's actually a path forward where the FDA gets the same kind of freedom that European regulators have to operate, without too much reference to free speech at all, which is very surprising given the trend of the past, 30 years. But I don't think we can take that off the table, given that the cases that are coming up to the Supreme Court are now, there's a set of conservative governors who really want to regulate speech. And they are encountering judges who are sometimes favorable to that, sometimes not. And it kind of depends which kind of Republican you are. So, I think there is a subset that think, okay, Republicans should get to regulate speech. But, there's a set that actually at least purports to be committed to a broader set of propositions, which would mean that the First Amendment was a ton smaller than sort of libertarian republicanism of the past 30 years. So the big caveat here is, if the Supreme Court ends up saying, we were just kidding about the past 60 years, that does mean that, Republican governors can lock a bunch of people up. But it also means that the FDA, I think, would have a much freer hand than it is. So, in that view, the answer would be, well, do they have the statutory authority to do it? And if they do, then we're done. Now, of course, the same people saying that that the Constitution is completely different than you thought also think that the statutory authority is limited. So, but that would be a completely different set of questions. So, and I say this, there's this big asterisk. At the same time, the lower courts are continuing to proceed as if nothing big is going to change. So what you see, so most recently, there's a court in Arkansas that permanently enjoined Arkansas's anti-fake meat law. So Arkansas had basically tried to ban people from using like hot dog to describe veggie hot dogs. And what the court said is quite relevant to your question, which is basically the burden is on the government to show that this stuff is misleading. So as long as reasonable consumers are going to understand what it is that you're saying, right, or aren't going to be misled by it, then the government has very limited options. So maybe it can make you use a disclaimer. But something like, well, we have one study, or, we have non-clinical evidence, right? Clinicians report that their patients get good results. As long as that's true, you might be able to say it. Subject to my really big asterisks, everything might change.
But let me ask you this question before you go further. You mentioned Supreme Court might change this. What cases is the Supreme Court looking at where this is becoming sort of relevant?
Well, okay, so the big opportunity will be in the social media regulation cases that the Supreme Court has taken for the next term. So they've already granted cert on two questions related to the Communications Decency Act, which is the provision that basically lets internet companies engage in moderation. And they are definitely 100% going to hear the social media cases coming out of Florida and Texas, which just for timing reasons, they haven't granted those yet, but it's going to happen. And in those cases, there's the Texas court basically said, well, the only question is what the First Amendment meant to the framers of the Constitution, and there's no indication that they thought that content moderation was within the freedom of speech, and so this law is fine. And frankly, that's sort of dubious originalism on its own, but okay. But if that's true, it is definitely the case that, the authorities in 1790 could, lock you up if you started selling something they didn't like.
Right.
Right. And so so that's what, I don't actually expect that they'll go all the way, although they might actually go half of the way in ways that are very politically targeted. But if we really took the idea that there is a thing called the freedom of speech, right? Mm-hmm. So as opposed to speech, which should be free, right? So the way this argument works is the Constitution says the freedom of speech, right? The First Amendment says, shall not be restricted, or Congress shall make no law. And it doesn't say Congress shall make no law restricting speech. It says Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of speech. So the argument from this version is that there is actually a distinct thing called the freedom of speech. Not all speech falls within it. So so the framers actually thought that the argument goes that there were some kinds of speech that were within the freedom, some kinds of speech that were outside of the freedom. Mostly what they thought was inside was political speech, but they were actually kind of willing to punish a lot of dissenting political speech too, right. Which is an awkwardness of this position. But anyway, so the idea would be, in order to get protection for your speech, you have to explain why the framers would have thought that it was within the freedom of speech, not just that it was speech. But of course, that's sort of completely different from how we've done it for the past 60 years, and so it's not clear that anybody even knows how to do it.
Can I ask a question there, though? And I feel like I'm in a law school class, but I get to play law student after so many years. So I'll take that chance. My question is, what I really hear you describing is pure speech. That would fall into that. Is that accurate, first of all?
So no, because they thought that again, in this view, which I don't like, I'm not a great exponent from it. It's not something that makes a ton of sense to me, but this is connected to larger ideas about the difference between liberty and license. So the argument goes that liberty was freedom to choose among a set of acceptable alternatives, whereas license was freedom to behave badly outside the acceptable boundaries. So so for example, you could be the framers were concerned, for example, about whether people could be sent to jail for denying the divinity of Christ. Right. Okay. And I would say probably, on balance, they thought, or at least many of them thought that you probably shouldn't go to jail for that. But it was sort of an active debate. Whereas they also, other than that, they didn't want a king, in terms of like, could you go to jail for insulting the ruler? Yeah. In large part, they didn't always think that was part of the freedom of speech. Right. Huh. So, sometimes they did, but again, they actively debated which kinds of speech were legitimate, okay. And so that vision is actually quite narrow about what speech is, and there are the past 30 years of originalism are not necessarily the prologue for what we're getting today. So in the past, the originalists sort of went hard for, freedom of speech. I don't really care who's speaking, but right. the idea that there was freedom of commercial speech at the founding, it's not. It requires a very weird, to me, reading of the sources. I mean, look, we're lawyers. It's possible. Right. But the more you get to the idea of the freedom of speech is a thing that is different from speech, like it's a subset, the harder it is to say, and commercial actors, are completely contained within that.
So it's interesting because you use the term commercial actors, but we're talking about scientific discussion in many ways. And how does that necessarily play itself out? Because depending on how you see things, everyone is a commercial actor. There's really no way to escape that. I can't think of one, at least. I'm sure maybe, I guess, individuals theoretically. But let's talk about any company, whether it's a academic institution, whether it's a pharmaceutical company or something else. If they're talking about a product, you're talking about a commercial actor potentially talking about a product that could be defended under scientific discussion, could be defended under sort of subject, not subject to being pure speech. I guess my question at that point is, if you have that type of analysis, are you saying that under this new analysis that could be had, you may not be subject, and the FDA can go out there and basically say, you know what, you aren't subject. We have additional authority, and therefore we can regulate exactly what you say. Because the FDA has been using another tactic as well, which you may or may not be familiar with, the whole idea of intended use or the implications of that. So how does all that come together then?
Right. So the answer is like so first of all, it's very hard to speculate about this because it isn't how the system has worked, for since the FDA's inception. So, in some ways, it's like the question. So the first question is, what kind of First Amendment are we going to get in the next couple of years? And if it's one where Facebook's First Amendment rights are sort of minimal, will that also be the case for Pfizer?
Right.
I'm a bit too cynical to think that couldn't be done. you know, although I hope it wouldn't be, at the very least, if we're, sauce for the goose ought to be sauce for the gander.
Yep.
Um, but lawyers are good at explaining why their guy is different from your guy. So I don't want to exclude it, and that's why I think it's very hard to talk at this moment in time, because there's now so much is on the table that 5 years ago was not. But we don't like the Arkansas court, last week did the absolutely conventional thing, and that's sort of the way to bed, I think. In which case, the FDA does still have to operate under significant constraints. So, it's a time of great uncertainty, is I guess where I end up, and I think that the basic justification, right, for protecting people against deception when they're not very capable of evaluating claims, and where there are sophisticated operations to get them to believe marketing claims, like the framers actually were aware of that there were people selling snake oil, right? And the question is, what if anything can the government do about that, and can the government substitute its judgment for the judgment of a whole bunch of different private actors, for good and for ill?
So let's sort of, it was a really great question you phrased, which is you've got a couple of states saying that Facebook should be governed in a specific way, and if Facebook has to be governed that way, does Pfizer need to be governed in the same way? Which I think is such an interesting question to ask. My question then becomes, so it sort of dovetails into what the FDA has recently released guidance on, which is the definition of the word healthy. Mm-hmm. And the position they've taken is, here's how we expect you to define it. Here's how we're using this definition. Under this new schema, if you will, that might come out, does the FDA sort of have to revisit its own guidances just because they now have more authority and can get away with more?
Yeah. So my sense is, probably not, that at least for a while, we're going to be operating under the regime where since the goal is basically consumer protection, right? That we will actually be still doing factual inquiries into, is this deceptive? If you don't do what the FDA says. And, one thing that courts are wary of is, too wary in my opinion, but what they don't like is basically they see the government sort of bootstrapping its regulation. So if the government says, okay, this is what milk means, and then if you don't agree with their meaning, then they will fine you. The courts are worried that they don't want to let the government write the rules about what counts as milk. Now, as somebody who sort of believes in the New Deal, I actually think the government should absolutely be able to tell you what counts as milk. There's a separate question about whether, if I say almond milk, you think milk, right? That's something where, okay, yes, people, almond milk actually is a meaningful qualifier, right? But if it just says milk, I kind of do think that the government should be able to tell, because individual consumers are just not capable of keeping up with that, right? Right. And if the milk isn't the thing that you expect, it really should be clearly labeled. And by the way, almond milk is a perfectly clear label, right? Although, there are some real complexities here. One of the things that my students have struggled with over the course of several years is, like, almond milk is understandable as, like, it's definitely not milk. What are the nutritional characteristics of almond milk? Can you actually, like, give your baby or your toddler almond milk instead of milk? And there's a couple of pretty disturbing reports about, basically vegan parents who nearly killed their very young children, thinking that they were giving, in complete good faith, like wanting nothing but the best. They still end up malnourishing kids because they're confused by the similarity in name. And so, I think regulators have reasonable concerns. But they're just so far courts are leaning against that, in part, I think, because those reasonable concerns have been meshed with basically meat industry self-protection, right? Because clearly, like, you don't necessarily need to ban the use of the word burger,
right?
If there's some way to tell people, this has a different amount of protein than you're expecting with your burger.
So is there a reasonable consumer standard that needs to be applied?
Yeah, so that's courts, that's what courts say they're doing. And the question is basically, who has the burden of showing what the reasonable consumer is like? When can the government sort of use common sense logic? So and I think there's a sort of rough justice. Like, the courts, I think, are pretty clear that you couldn't just start labeling your almond milk.
Okay.
That would be just be too disruptive, right? That is plausibly going to confuse a bunch of people. On the other hand, they can't. The government also probably can't bar the use of the word milk, at least where there are qualifiers that people can use, right, for their almond milk.
Yeah. Let's pick the word milk just because you have.
Mm-hmm.
Do we then need to start qualifying the source of milk? So cow milk versus buffalo milk versus goat milk.
Right. That's a great question. And so historically, right, the government has not been interested in that because it hasn't thought, that there was sort of great commercial significance. But you can imagine a world in which, if half the consumers are getting their milk from goats, then maybe we need a little better labeling, just because goat milk, as I recall from when my child was unable to breastfeed unless I was not drinking cow milk, right? You actually have to pay attention. If dairy is not all the same.
So it becomes a relevant issue that people will have to potentially deal with. And I guess today's conversation has kind of gone down this path of discussing the what if the Supreme Court goes in this proposed new direction. If everything else remains the same, let's say the Supreme Court, in its infinite judgment, comes out and goes, you know what? We weren't kidding. Everything's still the same. All the rules still apply.
Right.
How does that change the analysis, if at all? Like, would the FDA then be more controlled?
So it makes things harder for the FDA, right? Because so one of the interesting things about the sort of the regulatory state is we now fight about sort of evidence quality, right? So just as the FDA would like everybody to have two double-blind placebo-controlled studies, courts evaluating government regulators often want them to have quantifiable evidence, so there are times when the court says, you know what, like, my gut just completely agrees with you that this is misleading, so you don't need further evidence. But there are other times where they say, well, I'm not convinced that reasonable consumers would be confused by this, so you have to show evidence. And now we're talking about surveys, and are your surveys any good? And courts are actually quite willing to reject surveys, even when they seem to show that there's a fair amount of consumer confusion. So it makes things much less certain, is what I would say.
And that burden will always fall on the FDA to prove that.
So, I think that's right. With the question is one of specificity, right? So, for example, like, what should we make of the research that shows that, consumers believe that somebody has evaluated the safety and efficacy of all the supplements on the market? Mm-hmm. Right. And I think from a sort of regulatory perspective, the FDA should be able, at the very least, to rely on that, to start making rules, right? So it doesn't need to show that people expect their fish oil, right? Or whatever, the Garcinia right. that's evidence that's about sort of the market as a whole. This is how consumers think, and that so. If the government can rely on that kind of evidence to show, to say, okay, and we can reasonably extrapolate that in this particular instance, they will be normal, they will react like they react these other times, right? Then the FDA has paths forward to protect consumers. On the other hand, if courts get super, super specific and say, no, you have to show like this particular claim deceives consumers about this particular thing, it's going to be a lot harder to regulate. And this is not just about, I mean, to a certain extent, it's about political orientation, which determines how much evidence that people require. But, you know, it's also an orientation towards, like, what is the question? Is the question about the science of this particular treatment or supplement? Or is it about how consumers perceive things? Which is actually a very different question. And something that, like, cardiologists are just not in a position to opine in particularly interesting ways.
Agreed. No, that's absolutely fascinating. We're past time, and it's, as always, it is so incredibly fun to talk to you. Rebecca, this was amazing. But before we go, any last parting words?
I do think that I think that people are going to be surprised at the sort of interest group configurations that start showing up in the next few years. And honestly, that might be the only thing that can save us if we can actually do some, realignment so people can understand that, a radical version of the Constitution is actually not in anyone's interest at this point.
Thank you.
These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not create an attorney-client relationship.